I always knew my parents favored my sister, but I never expected them to be so blatant about it, so cruel in their final act. Sitting in that polished mahogany conference room, surrounded by expensive suits and the stale scent of legal paperwork, I listened as the attorney read my father's will in a steady, impersonal tone. My sister, Vivian, lounged beside me, her designer-clad legs crossed, her ruby-red lips curled into a smirk of anticipation. She already knew what was coming. She always knew. And to my eldest daughter, Vivian Margaret Ellison, the lawyer read, his voice smooth and rehearsed, "We leave the entirety of the Ellison estate, including all financial assets, stock holdings, and properties in New York, Paris, and London. Furthermore, she shall inherit the family trust with an annual allowance of—" Vivian made a dramatic show of sighing as she glanced at her perfectly manicured nails, feigning boredom despite the enormous fortune she was now legally entitled to enjoy. She flicked her gaze toward me, her amusement barely contained. And to my youngest daughter, Eleanor Grace Ellison, the lawyer continued, his tone never changing, never softening, "We leave the deed to the Ellison family farm and the land upon which it stands." Silence filled the room. I could feel my heartbeat drumming in my ears, my face heating with humiliation. The Ellison family farm. The words were so absurdly insulting that I almost laughed. The Ellison estate, where we had grown up, was a sprawling, historic mansion that had been in our family for over a century. Its chandeliers alone were worth more than what most people made in a lifetime. Our properties in New York, Paris, and London were the jewels of our family's investment portfolio, real estate that made headlines in luxury magazines. And then there was the farm, a decrepit, forgotten patch of land in the middle of nowhere, abandoned for decades, falling apart at the seams. Vivian chuckled under her breath, unable to contain her glee. "Oh, Ellie," she purred, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "I hope you enjoy shoveling cow manure for the rest of your life. Maybe you can start a little roadside produce stand. How charming." The lawyer cleared his throat, ignoring her cruelty, as he continued reading the legal jargon, confirming that the decision was final. My parents were gone, and this was their last word, their final division of love, or in my case, their final insult. I could have stormed out right then and there. I could have screamed at the unfairness of it all, demanded an explanation, asked why they had given my sister everything and left me with nothing but rotting wood and empty land. But I didn't. I refused to let Vivian see me break, refused to give her the satisfaction of witnessing my devastation. Instead, I signed the papers, accepted the deed to the worthless farm, and walked out of the conference room without another word. 2 days later, I stood in front of what was now legally mine, my old sedan kicking up dust as I pulled onto the overgrown gravel driveway. The Ellison farm looked exactly as I remembered from childhood, abandoned, eerie, and half-swallowed by nature. The barn was missing sections of its roof, its once red paint now peeling in grayish flakes. The old farmhouse loomed at the top of a small hill, its wooden siding warped from decades of neglect. I hadn't been here in over 20 years. When I was a child, my grandfather had lived on this land, refusing to leave even when my parents offered him a penthouse in the city. He had always been a strange man, full of secrets and old-world superstitions, muttering about protecting the land and keeping the past buried. When he died, my parents locked up the house, abandoned the farm, and never spoke of it again. Now, standing in front of the decaying remains of his world, I finally understood why. Something about this place felt wrong. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. The front porch creaked as I stepped onto it, the sound like a warning whisper. I dug through my bag, pulling out the ancient key the lawyer had given me. It took several tries, but finally, with a groan of rusted metal, the lock turned. The inside of the farmhouse was exactly as I remembered, dust-covered furniture, faded floral wallpaper, and the lingering scent of something old and forgotten. The grandfather clock in the hallway had long since stopped ticking, its hands frozen in time. Cobwebs draped the corners of the ceiling, undisturbed by human presence for decades. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something in my gut told me there was more to this place than met the eye. My grandfather had always been a peculiar man, and this house had always felt like it held secrets. I started in the study, the room where he had spent most of his time. The bookshelves were still filled with old, leather-bound volumes, their spines worn from use. His desk sat untouched, covered in dust, but otherwise exactly as he had left it. As I ran my fingers along the edge of the desk, something caught my eye, a faint scratch on the wooden floor beneath it, as if the desk had been moved repeatedly over the years. A hidden compartment, maybe? I pushed against the heavy oak structure, expecting resistance, but to my surprise, it slid easily across the floor. And there, beneath it, was something I never expected to find, a small metal ring embedded into the floorboards, like the handle of a trapdoor. My pulse quickened as I crouched down, wrapping my fingers around the cold metal. With a deep breath, I pulled. The floor creaked loudly as a hidden section of wood lifted, revealing a dark, gaping hole beneath. A secret room. A chill ran down my spine as I stared into the darkness below. What had my grandfather been hiding down there? And why had my parents left me this place while giving my sister everything else? Suddenly, I wasn't so sure the farm was worthless after all. I stood at the edge of the gaping hole, my breath shallow as I stared into the blackness beneath my grandfather's study. The floorboards around the trapdoor groaned under my weight, as if the house itself was reluctant to reveal whatever secrets had been buried below. Dust swirled in the dim light filtering through the tattered curtains, and a musty, unfamiliar scent drifted up from the hidden chamber, damp earth, aged wood, and something else, something metallic and sharp. My fingers tightened around the cold metal ring of the trapdoor, my mind racing through the possibilities. If my grandfather had hidden this space so carefully, there had to be a reason. He had always been a man of routines, meticulous in the way he maintained his old books and tools, yet no one had ever spoken about a basement or a hidden room beneath the farmhouse. My parents had locked this place up after his death without a second thought, as if they had no desire to know what was left behind. Had they known about this secret? Had they deliberately given me the farm because they wanted to keep me far away from the real fortune? The idea sent a fresh wave of determination through me, a slow-burning fire replacing the humiliation I had felt at the will reading. If they thought they could laugh at me, mock me for inheriting a worthless farm, they had no idea just how wrong they might be. I turned on my phone's flashlight, the beam piercing through the dust-filled air, illuminating a set of narrow wooden steps leading downward. The stairs looked old but sturdy, worn smooth in the center as if they had been used frequently. A heavy silence pressed down around me, thick and suffocating, like the house itself was holding its breath. I hesitated only a moment before placing my foot on the first step, testing its strength before shifting my weight. The wood creaked but held firm. Step by step, I descended, my heart pounding harder with each careful movement. The darkness seemed to swallow the light of my phone, the cold air growing heavier as I moved deeper underground. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, windowless chamber, the walls lined with rough stone instead of wood. A single lantern, old-fashioned and covered in cobwebs, sat on a wooden workbench to my right. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against a box of matches beside it. The first strike sparked, but failed to catch, my hand shaking slightly as I tried again. The second attempt produced a flicker, then a steady flame, the lantern casting a weak, golden glow across the space. As the shadows shifted, I took in my surroundings, my pulse quickening with each new detail. The walls were lined with shelves, filled not with books or tools, but with boxes, metal lockboxes of varying sizes, stacked neatly and labeled in my grandfather's precise handwriting. Some were marked with years, 1942, 1956, 1973, while others had names I didn't recognize. At the far end of the room stood a heavy wooden cabinet, its doors secured with an old iron lock. The only other piece of furniture was a large oak desk, its surface covered in yellowed documents, a tarnished key, and what appeared to be an old leather journal. I reached for the journal first, my fingers tracing the worn cover before I carefully opened it to the first page. The ink was faded but legible, the handwriting unmistakably my grandfather's. August 17th, 1942. They told me to bury it deep, to never speak of it again, but I cannot let the truth be forgotten. This land holds more than just history. It holds power, the kind men kill for, the kind families tear themselves apart over. I have done what I can to keep it hidden, but if you have found this, then you must be prepared for what comes next. A shiver ran down my spine as I turned the page, my hands gripping the leather tightly. December 4th, 1956. They came again, asking questions, offering money, making threats. They know something remains, but they do not know where. I will not give in. The Ellison name was built on more than just land and wealth. It was built on secrets, and some secrets must never be unearthed. I exhaled slowly, my mind spinning as I processed the weight of his words. My grandfather had been hiding something far more valuable than an old farm. Whatever it was, people had been searching for it, possibly for decades. I turned another page, then another, skimming through entries filled with warnings, mentions of men who visited late at night, of letters burned before they could be read. My grandfather had spent years protecting whatever lay beneath this house, but from what? And why had my parents left it to me rather than keeping it for themselves? I set the journal down, my gaze drifting toward the locked cabinet at the far end of the room. The tarnished key on the desk practically called to me, its surface dull with age, but still solid, still waiting. My fingers curled around the metal as I crossed the small space, my pulse roaring in my ears as I slid the key into the iron lock. The mechanism clicked, the sound echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. I pulled the doors open slowly, revealing what lay inside. Rows of velvet pouches lined the shelves, some small enough to fit in the palm of my hand, others larger, heavier. Beside them sat wooden boxes, intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize, their lids shut tight. In the center of the cabinet, resting on a thick cloth, was something that stole the breath from my lungs, a stack of old currency, the edges crisp despite their age. I reached for one of the pouches, my fingers trembling as I loosened the drawstring. The weight of the contents sent a jolt through my arm. As the pouch tipped slightly, a glint of gold caught the light. Coins. Not just any coins, but solid gold, stamped with dates that spanned centuries. I staggered backward, my legs suddenly weak. This wasn't just old money. This was treasure. The farm was never meant to be worthless. My parents had given it to me because they had no idea what was hidden here. But my grandfather had. And now I did too. For the first time since the will reading, I smiled. Let Vivian have her mansions, her stock holdings, her trust funds. I had something better. I had a secret that could change everything. The dim lantern light flickered against the stone walls, casting jagged shadows that danced around me as I stood frozen before the cabinet. The weight of the pouch in my hands was heavier than just gold. It was history, deception, and something far more powerful than I had anticipated. My grandfather had spent decades protecting whatever was hidden beneath this farm, leaving behind cryptic warnings in his journal, carefully concealing this wealth from prying eyes. I had spent my entire life believing I was the forgotten daughter, the afterthought in a family that had only ever valued my sister. But standing here, staring at the gleaming gold in my palm, I realized that I wasn't forgotten. I had been chosen. The thought sent a shiver down my spine as I carefully closed the pouch, setting it back onto the cabinet shelf before reaching for one of the wooden boxes. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid, revealing layers of old documents, their parchment delicate with age. Some were written in my grandfather's handwriting, but others were even older, their ink faded and curling at the edges. I picked up the first page, my eyes scanning the words carefully. June 12th. 1879. The transaction is complete, though I fear the weight of this decision will linger beyond my years. We have secured the land, but the cost of its fortune will always be a burden upon the Ellison name. There are those who will seek it, those who would see blood spilled to claim it. It must remain hidden, lest we suffer the fate of those before us. The name at the bottom of the document wasn't my grandfather's, it was his grandfather's. This had begun long before I was born, before my parents, even before my grandfather had taken over the farm. This secret, this wealth, had been protected for generations, buried within the very foundation of the land while the world above remained unaware. I reached for another document, this one marked with a wax seal, its red imprint cracked with age. Carefully, I peeled it open, revealing another handwritten entry. October 3rd, 1902. The Spanish shipment was lost to history, but we know the truth of it. The gold never sank with the fleet, it was taken, hidden, and smuggled onto this land. The story has been rewritten to keep men from searching, but there will always be those who suspect. They have come before, and they will come again. The land must never be sold, and the treasure must never be spent, lest we bring ruin upon the family. A chill settled deep into my bones as the pieces of the puzzle began to take shape in my mind. My grandfather had always told strange stories when I was a child, old legends whispered in the quiet of the farmhouse while the fire crackled in the background. He had spoken of ships that vanished, of fortunes lost and never found, of people who dedicated their lives to chasing something just beyond their reach. I had never thought anything of it, dismissing them as nothing more than bedtime stories, tales meant to amuse a little girl who had no idea what she was truly hearing. But now, as I stood in this hidden chamber, my hands shaking with the weight of history, I realized that they hadn't been stories at all. My family had been guarding stolen treasure for over a century. The thought sent my pulse racing as I took a step back, my mind reeling with the implications. If my grandfather had dedicated his life to keeping this hidden, if he had refused to let the land be sold, then he must have believed there was still danger in revealing the truth. The documents confirmed that people had come looking before, men who had suspected the existence of the treasure, but had never been able to prove it. Had my parents known? Had they been aware of what lay beneath this house, or had they abandoned the farm in ignorance, believing it to be worthless? I thought of my sister, of the way she had laughed in that conference room, so certain that she had won. She had taken the wealth she could see, the fortune that came with stocks, real estate, and luxury. But the real fortune, the one that could never be measured on a bank statement, had been given to me. And now, I was the only one who knew the truth. A sharp creak from above sent my heart slamming against my ribs, the noise breaking through the suffocating silence of the chamber. My breath caught in my throat as I quickly shut the wooden box, my fingers fumbling as I placed it back inside the cabinet. Someone was in the house. I had locked the front door when I arrived, making sure that no one could follow me inside, yet the distinct sound of floorboards groaning under weight sent a fresh wave of fear rushing through me. My phone's flashlight flickered against the stone walls as I turned toward the staircase, listening intently as another sound echoed above. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the farmhouse with careful intent. I swallowed hard, forcing my breathing to remain steady as I quickly extinguished the lantern, plunging the chamber into darkness. My pulse pounded in my ears as I took slow, cautious steps toward the staircase, straining to hear through the silence. A floorboard creaked again, this time closer. I pressed myself against the cool stone wall, gripping my phone tightly, my mind racing with possibilities. Had Vivian sent someone? Had my parents left behind more than just ignorance? Had they left behind enemies? I waited, my body tense, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it against my ribs. Whoever was above me wasn't moving randomly. They were searching. Another sound this time, the distinct shuffle of papers being moved. My grandfather's study. A sharp spike of adrenaline surged through me as I realized what was happening. Whoever had entered the farmhouse wasn't just wandering. They were looking for something. They were looking for exactly what I had just found. I took a slow, careful breath, my fingers curling around the iron key still clutched in my palm. My grandfather had spent his life protecting this secret, ensuring that no one could find it. Now, I was the only one standing between that treasure and whoever was searching above. For the first time since I had arrived at this farm, I didn't feel like I had inherited a burden. I had inherited a responsibility, and I wasn't about to let someone else claim what had been hidden for generations. I exhaled slowly, steadied my grip, and began my silent ascent up the staircase, ready to face whoever was waiting for me in the dark. The wooden steps creaked beneath my feet as I climbed, each movement deliberate and controlled, my breath shallow as I listened for any further signs of the intruder. The darkness of the hidden chamber clung to my skin like a second layer, a reminder of the secret I had just uncovered and the danger that knowledge now carried. Whoever had entered the farmhouse was not here by accident. They were searching for something, and considering the way they moved, they had some idea of what they were looking for. A slow exhale escaped my lips as I reached the top of the staircase, my fingers tightening around the iron key in my palm, its edges digging into my skin. My phone's flashlight had been turned off the moment I heard the footsteps, leaving me in near total darkness. Only the faintest sliver of moonlight slipped through the boarded-up windows of the study, casting narrow beams onto the dust-covered floor. I paused just before pushing open the trapdoor fully, straining to listen. A faint rustling sound drifted from the other side of the room, the unmistakable whisper of paper being shuffled, as if someone were carefully sifting through my grandfather's desk. The thought sent a surge of adrenaline racing through my veins, my muscles tensing with the weight of realization. This wasn't a random break-in. Whoever was here had gone straight for my grandfather's study, the very room that concealed the chamber below. They weren't rummaging through the kitchen looking for valuables, nor were they stumbling around in confusion. They had a purpose, and if they had managed to get inside without forcing the door, they had likely been here before or at least known exactly what they were doing. The idea sent a cold chill curling down my spine. I braced myself and pushed the trapdoor open just enough to allow me a sliver of vision. The desk sat against the far wall, its surface barely visible in the dim moonlight filtering through the old lace curtains. The chair, which had been tucked neatly beneath it when I arrived, was now slightly askew, a sign that someone had been sitting there only moments ago. Then I saw him. A dark silhouette loomed over the desk, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the angle of the shadows. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, sifting through my grandfather's old paperwork, lifting pages only to set them down again with the impatience of someone searching for something specific. A faint glint of metal caught my eye at his waist, something clipped to his belt, possibly a knife or a gun. My pulse pounded against my ribs as I considered my options. I could stay hidden, waiting for him to leave, but if he was looking for the treasure, there was no way he would stop until he found it. If I revealed myself, I had no way of knowing if he was armed, dangerous, or even willing to talk. But one thing was certain, he had no idea I was here. For now, that was my only advantage. I took a slow breath, steadying my grip on the iron key, and pressed my free hand against the floor, bracing myself for movement. The air in the farmhouse had grown thick with the scent of old wood and dust, the silence stretching between us like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap at any moment. Then, the intruder stiffened. He stopped rummaging through the papers and slowly turned his head, his movements deliberate as if he had sensed something was off. Had I made a noise? Had he heard me shift the trapdoor? My stomach twisted as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness. The circle of light danced across the floor, moving toward the bookshelves before sweeping across the desk, illuminating the faded ink on the documents scattered across its surface. Then, the beam traveled lower, passing over the floorboards, the dust-coated rug, and I held my breath. The light hovered directly over the trapdoor. The man froze. For a moment, neither of us moved, the only sound in the room the slow, measured rhythm of our breathing. Then, in a single motion, he dropped the flashlight onto the desk and lunged toward the trapdoor, his fingers curling around its edge. I reacted on instinct. With all the strength I could muster, I shoved the trapdoor upward, slamming it into his chest and sending him stumbling backward. The impact was enough to throw him off balance, his hands flailing as he crashed against the desk, knocking over stacks of paper and sending a heavy wooden box tumbling to the floor. I scrambled up through the opening, my pulse hammering in my ears as I braced myself against the desk, gripping the iron key like a weapon. The intruder recovered quickly, his dark eyes locking onto mine, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he straightened himself. Now that he was fully illuminated by the dim light of the moon, I could see him more clearly. Short dark hair, a strong jawline, and a face that was eerily familiar. Then, it hit me. I had seen this man before. Not in person, but in photographs. My grandfather had an old family album, one I had flipped through as a child, filled with black and white images of long-lost relatives, faces frozen in time. This man, his face, his features, bore an unmistakable resemblance to one of them. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt, my grip on the key tightening as I took a step back. The man studied me for a long moment before exhaling sharply, as if weighing his next words. "You're not supposed to be here," he finally said, his voice low and edged with something I couldn't quite place. I narrowed my eyes. "And you are?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the open trapdoor, realization dawning in his expression. He knew. "You found it," he muttered, half to himself, his posture shifting as if he was preparing for something. I didn't answer. Instead, I slowly positioned myself between him and the trapdoor, my pulse hammering with the weight of the moment. If he was here for the treasure, he wasn't leaving without a fight. A slow, humorless smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I was wondering which one of you they'd leave it to," he said, his tone almost amused. "Guess I have my answer." I swallowed hard, my mind racing as I tried to piece together his words. He knew about the inheritance. He knew about the treasure. And worse, he had been waiting. For me. I stood between the stranger and the open trapdoor, my fingers tightening around the iron key as if it were the only thing tethering me to reality. The farmhouse walls, once merely old and abandoned, now seemed to close in around us, the weight of history pressing against my chest. My mind churned with questions, each one racing against the sharp pulse of fear tightening in my ribs. He knew about the inheritance. He knew about the treasure. And worse, he had been waiting for me. The stranger exhaled slowly, his dark eyes scanning my face with something eerily close to recognition, though I was certain I had never met him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his stance casual but controlled, as if he were accustomed to assessing threats and planning his next move. His resemblance to the men in my grandfather's old photographs was undeniable, the strong jawline, the sharp cheekbones, even the same intensity in his gaze that I had once seen captured in faded black and white images. "You don't know who I am, do you?" His voice was measured, calm in a way that made my skin crawl, like a hunter toying with its prey before the final strike. I didn't answer, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of confirming his suspicions. Instead, I took a slow step back, positioning myself further between him and the open trapdoor, my mind racing with possible escape routes. The corner of his mouth twitched, amusement flickering in his expression as if he could see the gears turning in my mind. "Relax, Eleanor," he said, my name rolling off his tongue too easily, too familiarly. "If I wanted to hurt you, I wouldn't have wasted time flipping through papers in the dark." The fact that he knew my name sent a fresh wave of unease curling down my spine, but I refused to let it show. "Funny," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, because breaking into my house in the middle of the night doesn't exactly scream friendly intentions. His lips curled slightly, not quite a smile, not quite a smirk, something calculated, like a man used to playing a long game. "This isn't your house," he corrected, tilting his head slightly as he studied me. "This is Ellison land. And I have as much right to it as you do." A cold chill settled deep in my chest at his words, but I didn't let my expression waver. "That's interesting," I said, forcing my grip on the key to loosen slightly, feigning a calm I didn't feel. "Because last I checked, my name was the only one on the deed." He let out a quiet chuckle, the sound low and almost condescending. Deeds are just paper, Eleanor. Blood is what really matters. The words sent a sharp pulse of something dangerously close to panic through me, though I didn't fully understand why. Blood. Legacy. Family. My grandfather's journal had been filled with cryptic warnings about the treasure, about those who had sought it before. But never once had he mentioned that someone else, someone outside my immediate family, might have a claim to it. You don't look like an Ellison, I said finally, watching him carefully, searching for a lie in his expression. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. That's because I'm not, he admitted, his gaze flicking toward the trapdoor before returning to me. Not exactly, anyway. Something inside me twisted at his choice of words, at the deliberate vagueness in his answer. Explain, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. His gaze held mine for a long moment before he finally spoke. Your grandfather wasn't the only one who knew the truth about what was buried here, he said, his voice quieter now, but still edged with certainty. He wasn't the only one who spent his life protecting it. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat thudding in my ears as I tried to process what he was saying. You're telling me you're part of some secret family branch that my grandfather conveniently forgot to mention? A ghost of a smile flickered across his lips. Something like that, he said. My name is Marcus Vaughn. My grandmother, your grandfather's sister, was supposed to inherit this land. But when she left, when she chose to walk away from the Ellison name, your grandfather made sure her children would never have a claim to it. I felt the breath catch in my throat as the pieces of the puzzle began to shift into place. I had never heard of my grandfather having a sister. My parents had never spoken of another branch of the family tree, had never mentioned the possibility that someone else might have a right to the land. But then again, they had barely acknowledged the farm's existence in the first place. If what he was saying was true, if his family had been denied the inheritance generations ago, then that meant. You think the treasure belongs to you, I said slowly, my voice carefully controlled, though inside, my mind was spinning. Marcus held my gaze, his expression unreadable. Not just me, he corrected. It belongs to both of us. The difference is, I knew about it long before you did. The weight of his words settled heavily in my chest, the reality of the situation becoming clearer with every passing second. If he had been watching, waiting, if he had known about the treasure his entire life, then he had far more experience in this game than I did. But what was his end goal? You didn't break in here just to introduce yourself, I said finally, my voice sharpening as I took another step toward the desk, forcing him to shift his stance. What exactly do you want? For the first time, his expression darkened, the amusement in his eyes dimming slightly. I want what my family was denied, he said simply. I want the truth. And I want to make sure you don't do something reckless with something you don't fully understand. The words sent a fresh jolt of anger through me, my grip on the iron key tightening again. You don't get to decide what I do with my inheritance, I shot back, my voice firm despite the uncertainty curling in my gut. Marcus exhaled, his jaw tightening slightly as he studied me. Maybe not, he admitted. But trust me, Eleanor, if you don't play this carefully, there are others who will try to decide for you. A thick silence settled between us, heavy with unspoken warnings and unanswered questions. I had spent years thinking I had been cast aside by my family, left with nothing but a worthless farm. Now, in the span of a single night, I had discovered an underground vault of gold, uncovered a forgotten branch of my family tree, and come face to face with a man who claimed that blood mattered more than deeds. And, worse than all of that, I had a feeling he wasn't lying about the danger that was coming next. The farmhouse had always been silent in the way abandoned places often were, filled with the weight of time rather than the presence of life. But now, as Marcus Vaughn stood before me, his gaze sharp with warning, that silence carried something new, expectation, a heavy pause before something inevitable unfolded. His presence, his claim, his quiet certainty that others were watching, waiting, calculating their move, all of it settled over me like the dust that had coated my grandfather's old desk, undisturbed until I arrived to brush it away. I had spent years believing my family had discarded me, that I had been nothing more than an afterthought to my parents, an inconvenience next to my sister's perfect, polished existence. But standing in this old house, standing before the man who claimed to be my blood yet not my kin, I realized the truth was far more complicated. I hadn't been discarded. I had been hidden, protected in a way I had never understood. And now, because of my discovery, that protection was gone. I exhaled slowly, forcing my fingers to relax around the iron key still clutched in my hand, its edges pressing hard into my palm. Marcus's words still echoed in my mind, threading through the mess of thoughts spiraling through my head. If you don't play this carefully, there are others who will try to decide for you. I met his gaze, searching for a crack in his certainty, some sign that he was exaggerating, that he was trying to manipulate me into handing over something he believed should have been his all along. But there was no deception in his face, no hint of calculation beyond the simple truth of his warning. Who else is looking for it? I asked finally, my voice measured despite the slow, steady pulse of unease tightening in my chest. If you knew about the treasure all this time, then you must know who's still searching for it. Marcus exhaled, his fingers brushing along the edge of my grandfather's desk, his expression momentarily unreadable. There have always been people looking for it, he admitted, his voice lower now, weighted with something that felt dangerously close to regret. Some are just descendants of those who lost it, families who have spent generations trying to track it down. But others... He hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly. Others are less concerned with history and more concerned with profit. The kind of people who don't care about bloodlines or inheritance. The kind who take what they want, regardless of who stands in their way. His words settled into my chest like a stone, pressing against the fragile acceptance I had been trying to build since the moment I found the hidden room. It wasn't just about gold or history. It was about power, about the lengths people would go to claim something they believed should be theirs. I had seen the way my sister had laughed in that conference room, so certain that she had won, that she had taken everything of value while I had been left with nothing. But Vivian had never known about this. If she had, she would have fought for it. She would have manipulated, bribed, blackmailed, whatever it took to get her hands on something that could never be replaced. If there were people more ruthless than my sister looking for the treasure, then I had just become their newest target. I took a slow breath, steadying the thoughts racing through my mind. If that's true, I said carefully, then why haven't they found it yet? If my grandfather spent his entire life protecting it, then he must have had ways to keep it hidden. Marcus nodded slightly, his gaze flicking toward the open trapdoor, the soft glow of the lantern still casting shadows against the rough stone walls below. He did, he admitted. And for a long time, it worked. But now that you've inherited the land, people will start asking questions. People who have been waiting for the Ellison name to change hands. A slow chill curled down my spine at his words, but I refused to let it show. I had already spent too many years letting other people dictate my worth, allowing their decisions to shape my life without ever fighting back. That ended now. So what do you expect me to do? I asked, tilting my chin slightly, refusing to let him see the small, persistent tremor running through my fingers. Hand it over? Let you decide what happens to it. Marcus let out a short, quiet breath that might have been amusement, but it was gone before I could be sure. No, he said simply. I expect you to decide what happens to it. But I also expect you to understand that whatever choice you make comes with consequences. The weight of his words settled over me, heavier than even the gold I had found hidden beneath the farmhouse. There was no easy answer. If I sold the treasure, if I tried to convert it into money, I would leave a trail that others could follow, a path that would inevitably lead back to me. If I kept it, if I tried to protect it as my grandfather had done, then I would be forced to spend my life guarding a secret that had already stolen years from the people who had come before me. And if I destroyed it, if I ensured that no one could ever find it again, then I would be erasing something that had shaped my family's legacy for over a century. My grandfather had spent his life making that choice. Now it was my turn. I took a slow, steady breath, then met Marcus's gaze with quiet determination. I need time, I said finally. Time to figure out what happens next. Time to decide if this treasure is a curse or a gift. Marcus studied me for a long moment before nodding, something unreadable flickering in his expression. Time is a dangerous thing to waste, he said quietly. But it's yours to take. I exhaled, my fingers finally loosening around the iron key as I glanced toward the open trapdoor one last time. The weight of the past, the choices made by those who came before me, all of it had led to this moment. And for the first time in my life, I held something no one else could take away. My fate, my family's legacy, my future. It all belonged to me.